Good afternoon, good evening, folks, and yeah, glad you're here. This is Coded Live. I'm your host, Sam Basu. With me, I have my good old friend Ed Charbeneau. How are you, sir?
Doing good, Sam. Doing good for a
Good,
Monday.
good. Yeah. So, if you join us for regular streams and coding sessions here on Twitch, this is different. It's a little bit more formal. And by formal, I don't mean like we are in formal shirts, but it's a user group meeting. All right, so Ed's here, and we're going to talk about some Blazor and some CSS, right?
Right?
That'll be fun. All right.
Uh, we kind of misadvertised or
Yeah,
advertised it
that's
incorrectly, but
that's good. Yeah.
I was thinking Blazor with CSS, and I said Blazor with JavaScript. So that was what got tweeted out and shared for the last couple days, but it's all good.
No worries at all. All right. So before we hand it over to Ed, let's do a minute or two of housekeeping here. If I can share my screen. There you go. All right. Full screen. Cool. All right. So, yeah, welcome, folks. Welcome. And if you did not know where you ended up, Ed, you have seen this history, but this is a user group talk. This is a user group meeting, a meetup group that we used to have in Columbus, Ohio. We started way back in 2008. It was called Central Ohio Windows Phone User Group. We spent a good amount of years on that thing. And it was fun. But then we said, oh, let's open it up to Windows. So everything Windows. And then we're like, oh, we are getting plenty of Azure and cloud and Mac and mobile talks or, voice assistants. So let's just make it the Columbus App Dev user group, which we thought was, generic enough. And then, the pandemic happened. And we're like, yeah, let's just go to everything digital. So we are global. And unless we're moving to Mars, I think we are safe with with this domain and this generic name. So, welcome. This is the Columbus, or rather, Global App Dev User Group. You can find us online. It's our website. We got a meetup site. We are on Twitch, and we meet right here. Actually, this is not the third Monday because I was tied up last Monday. I was traveling. So this is the fourth Monday actually this month, but normally we are on third Mondays each month. Glad you're here. We do have some folks who support us. Progress. Both Ed and me work at Progress Software. Gives us the platform. We are always working with Microsoft to give us, a lot of swag and different things. And we haven't done physical swag in a while, but we'll do some licenses once in a while. And then we also partner up with 1105 Media, which I'll talk about, who put on conferences. However, we start with our sister user group all the time. That's our .NET user group, still based out of Columbus, Ohio. And looks like, so they meet fourth Thursdays of each month, and some weeks it ends up being the same, or some months it ends up being the same week. But looks like they're talking this Thursday about Azure Cosmos DB and the Gremlin API, and our good friend Sarah Dukewitz is going to be speaking, so that should be fun. And I think they try live streaming as well, but also they tried a meeting in person. So that's coming up this Thursday. A few things that are coming up on the horizon, both regionally as well as globally. We have a little thing called .NET Conf that's coming up. This has kind of become the de facto virtual conference for all things .NET. Every November, we have a .NET Conf, and then in between Novembers, we have different focus events, like focus on .NET MAUI, focus on F#, focus on cloud, and so on. But this one's the main one, and it's coming up November 8th to the 10th, and .NET 7 is scheduled to come out. So interesting times, and I hear, Ed, you're going to make an appearance. Are you on
Yes,
mute?
I am, Sam.
Oh, there
I'm
you go.
sorry. I'm fighting with that second monitor. It decided. Whoops! And I just took over your.
Oh, no
There
worries. There you go.
Yeah. So I do have a presentation for .NET Conf, and it is actually the
Third
presentation
day.
I'm doing tonight.
Yeah, so you
So
folks are being
yeah.
treated to a longer version of this, and then Ed's going to try
Exactly.
to Ed's going to try to be a rap singer and do it in 20 minutes.
Yeah, that's there's four major sections to it, so I probably am gonna have to cut something for the .NET Conf show because it's only 20 minutes. So yeah, I'm gonna have to figure
Yeah.
that out tonight.
Yeah, but a lot of good folks, speaking here, a lot of good content, and the first day is pretty much all high end, higher level keynote type talks, and then they kind of do deep dives on day two, and day three is all about the community. A lot of us, help out with hosting, but we go like 24 hours straight all around the world, from speakers from all around the world, hosts from all around the world. So it should be a lot of fun, and you're going to see .NET 7 come out. So exciting times coming up. But at about the same time, though, a few of us are also going to be at a place in Pocono Mountains in Pennsylvania. This is Tech Bash, a big conference that happens, and it's at a water park, good old Kalahari. It's a water park where you can be in your flip-flops, even though it's cold outside. But they got 3 days of solid content, one workshop day. And I think they're going to live stream some stuff from .NET Conf into Tech Bash, and then from Tech Bash into .NET Conf as well. So looking forward to this as well. And a lot of familiar faces that you see in the dev community. So a lot of good content coming up. All right, so speaking of Visual Studio Live, we partner with these folks, and they put on some really, really good shows all throughout the country. And the next one that's coming up is actually their biggest show of the year. They combine like 4 different conferences into one, like SQL Server, Tech Mentor, AI, and Cloud and Containers. But Visual Studio Live is really the dev part of it. For .NET devs. So that's coming up in Orlando in November, mid-November. So if you want to go, you get a big discount as a part of a user group. So, check out the agenda, check out what's on offer, and then come and join us in Orlando if your time and budget permits. So that's what's coming up. And then this evening we have, drum rolls, Mr. Charbeneau is here to talk about CSS techniques. I don't think. How much do you like talking about JavaScript these days?
Not very much. Not too excited about it. I mean, I know it. I'm just not excited about it. I'm not using
JavaScript
it anymore.
inside out, yeah.
So,
but that's kind of the point of what Blazor brings to the table is .NET and C# front and back. So nothing like it. So yeah, with that, why don't you take over and tell us all the things? So I'm going to bring your screen up, and off we go.
Yeah, so I want to talk about writing CSS for Blazor. So I think this is where a lot of devs actually struggle with Blazor, is how to write CSS and when to use certain tools at certain times. So I thought I'd talk about some 4 major areas, and there's some kind of sub breakdowns inside of these areas too. So first of all, we've got the good old fashioned Sass tool, something that I still use and like. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I think there's some misunderstandings there about how you install it, how you use it. Then there's the feature for Blazor called CSS Isolation. So we'll talk a little bit about what exactly CSS Isolation is, how does it help you with Blazor, and when should you use it. Then we'll talk about scope management with CSS. So when you're working with components in Blazor and you have your CSS style sheets, there's ways to control scope. So what CSS can be affected by component parameters, what CSS can be affected by variables, Sass properties, things like that. And there's various ways to control these, and there's kind of a sliding scale of how you can approach this, and I think it's pretty interesting. And then last but not least, we'll talk about the frameworks that are out there that are really popular, and my opinions on where those stand.
So Ed, before you start, just really quick, just saying hello to the folks who are part of the user group and our regulars, but also anybody else who is just tuning in. While Ed is watching or speaking, I'm going to be the annoying sidekick asking lots of dumb questions. But you folks should feel free to just chime in and ask any questions, and I will repeat them to Ed, and we'll talk about things as we go.
Yeah. Absolutely, and those questions are really important because I do need to boil this down to 20 minutes for .NET Conf, and I need to figure out what exactly will help people the most so I can present on those specific topics that are within these 4 bullet points here. So first of all, the presentation that you see is written in Blazor with just very little code, mostly CSS and HTML. but it is Blazor based, and it's not PowerPoint. So everything that you see on screen was designed with CSS, and it's basically a Blazor component somewhere inside of that application. I'll share the link for the GitHub repo at the end here as well. So let's start off with Sass. Sass is a tool that's been around for quite some time now. It's a superset of CSS, so any CSS can be read and compiled by Sass. It is actually developed in Dart these days. So you can use it without any JavaScript or NPM tooling. So I think that's something that not everybody knows. They feel like you need to have, Webpack or Gulp or Grunt or some kind of build system to pull this Sass tool in and actually compile the Sass, but it's actually just a command line tool that you can run if you have Dart installed on your machine. So it's actually really quick and easy to get installed, and it gives you some nice features that Sass doesn't necessarily have. One thing that we do have in Sass is variables these days. They're called CSS Custom Properties. There's a whole section we'll talk about that. But we do have Sass variables. We have nesting capabilities, let you write code simpler with less Sass or less CSS code. So less is more here. And then we have modules and mixins, and these are ways to compartmentalize your code, add scope, make things more modular and easier to maintain. Did you have a question, Sam? I heard a mic cut in.
Yeah, I had no idea it was written in Dart.
Mm-hmm. So a couple of years back, they decided they were going to speed this up by using a compiled language. Originally, it was written with Ruby, which is interpreted. And then they moved to libsass, and then it kind of developed into Dart Sass. So it executes extremely quick, and it's nice that you brought that point up, Sam, because one of the things that people might have moved away from Sass or had ill feelings towards Sass is because it was slow. Since that move to Dart, it executes extremely quick. So if you're, looking to build application-wide themes, you want to use variables, maybe you want light theme, dark theme, something that's easy to change if the company changes brand colors, things like that. Sass is going to be helpful there. There's also a lot of advanced things that it can do with math, color transformation, mapping arrays from one set to another, really advanced logic and loops and things like that. There are generic CSS utilities that you can use, and these are libraries of mix-ins that you can get additional functionality that doesn't come with the basic Sass modules. And it's nice if you're creating generic component libraries like we do at Progress. We have Kendo UI, we have Telerik UI for Blazor and MVC, and we have these generic component libraries that we want you to be able to customize with your own themes very easily. So Sass is a great way to do that. We ship you the Sass code, you change some variables, and you can theme it exactly how you would like. Sass is great for non-Blazor elements. If it's, you want to theme something that is just HTML and CSS, then this is a great place to start. And if you're using Bootstrap, Sass is going to elevate that Bootstrap game and give you a lot more flexibility with Bootstrap. It makes it a lot easier to theme your Bootstrap components and elements that you're using. Bootstrap is actually built with Sass, by the way. Now, installing Sass is something that is literally like two command line commands. So, like I said, a lot of misconceptions about Sass come from this long life of, Sass being this add-on tool, and it gets kind of bundled with Webpack or something like that, and gets into this black box territory where you don't know what exactly is happening. You just know that this thing compiles your Sass. And then you get into Blazor, and there's not a lot of NPM, and you're not using these JavaScript tools, and you might feel a little lost because you're used to this coming along with things like Create React App and the Angular CLI. So since it's Dart and Sass is a library built on Dart, you don't need JavaScript or NPM to install it. So you can actually use this with NPM and JavaScript if you'd like, but it's going to run and execute a lot faster if you just use the native Dart binaries. So depending on how your machine is set up, I use Chocolatey myself on Windows. You could say Choco install Sass, and that's going to install the Sass library for you. And then once you have that, you just have an input and an output, and you say Sass. Here's my input Sass file, and you point it towards an output. I do see a typo here. That should be output.css, not output.sass, but you basically run the tool at the command line. So you install it, then you run it. That's the only two commands that you're ever going to really need. If you do use Node.js for some reason and you want that NPM experience, you can install it via NPM, and you can use the npx command with those inputs and outputs to compile it with a Node script as well. So you've got options here.
So question here. So Sass will do its thing irrespective of what type of app it is. Like you literally give it a Sass file and it's spitting out a CSS file?
Absolutely. So it doesn't care that you're on Blazor. It doesn't care that you use Node. You can compile a Sass file using the Dart version, no matter what web stack you're using.
Okay, but then I mean, if you are building something with JavaScript or with Blazor, then this could be part of your build script that it just compiles it every time you do a build.
Matter of fact, we can run this from MS Build. So if you really want this to fire off every time you build your project, you can go into your CS proj file and add these targets and tell it to execute Sass, whether you're using Dart Sass or NPM Sass. You can execute it on build, and you can say, do you want to build this before the debug executes or before I release? And every time you run your application, you're going to get the latest version of the CSS file that this creates. So it's really simple to set this up. You don't need to be a Webpack wizard. You don't even need Webpack. I would actually advise against it unless you're using some other tools that are very JavaScript intensive. And again, you can use it with Node if you do want to use it with Node. So you'd basically do an npm init and then write a script inside of your package.json file that leverages the JavaScript version of the Sass runtime. One thing I like about Sass, it makes things easy to organize. I like to put things in a folder, whether it's called Sass or theme or whatever. Doesn't really matter. But once you're in that subfolder, it's nice to be able to break things down into different modules. Sass is great for doing very modular CSS. And if you want to look at sources to learn more about how to write modular Sass code, look at the Bootstrap project on GitHub. So it's really a great example of best practices on how to write good modular Sass code. And then there's some extra tooling that's available as well. If you are using the NPM version of this, Task Runner Explorer is a nice way to execute these Node scripts within Visual Studio without having to leave Visual Studio. So this is something that I often have installed, and instead of having to jump down to the command line and run something or mess with the build file, you could actually just pull up a GUI inside of Visual Studio and click on a command to execute that build and build out your Sass. All right. Question, Sam?
Yeah, quick question. And I'm not a web developer. I'm just not as in tune with some of these shifts in technology. Is Less pretty much done?
Less has been dead for quite some time, in my opinion. Bootstrap abandoned it about 5 years ago, I think. And once that happened, it really declined pretty quickly. There are still people that are latched onto it, love it. I think it may be maintained still, but there's not a lot of users out there.
Got it.
The next thing is very Blazor specific. We're going to talk about CSS isolation, scoping components, component-based CSS, lots of very Blazor specific stuff here. So Blazor has a concept of isolation of CSS. And what it does is it takes the CSS code and it kind of bundles that with the component in a file that's named in the same naming convention as the component itself. And this helps you maintain your code without kind of stepping over other CSS properties and things. It kind of takes the cascading out of cascading style sheets. So it did rub me the wrong way at first. I wasn't quite sure how I'd use this, but there are some really good uses for CSS isolation. So if you have things that that aren't part of a global style sheet, something that's very specific to a component, you want to put that in CSS isolation. If this is like a global style that's going to be affecting multiple components, you want to keep that outside of CSS isolation and in something like a Sass file. This is to avoid conflicts with nested content and things like that, though, so it can help you in some respects.
So two quick questions before we go. Do the other frameworks have anything similar, like Angular and React?
Angular and React both have concepts of CSS isolation. And they Vue as well. And it handles it in a very similar way to what I'm about to show you here. And basically what happens is at build time, the CSS isolation is part of the compile process. And it will take, for example, if I have an H1 in my component, it will add this little GUID bit to it. And it uses a very special selector, which it will append to your CSS code that is part of your component. And it will append that in a very highly specified CSS selector. So you're not going to accidentally override this H1 tag. So this is where you want to, use this for something that's very specific to the component, because if you're building something like we do at Progress, where we have generic component libraries, if we used CSS isolation, this would be very bad for our customers because they wouldn't be able to override the styles and make these components look and feel like their brand. So you want to do this with things that are specific to that component. Maybe it's a card component, and that card, you want a very rigid container. You want it to look a certain way. Maybe you still want some colors to be able to be overridden. So you might take some of the coloring aspects of it and put those in your global style sheet, but keep maybe the layout portion of it as part of the component. So it's up to you and what exactly you are trying to do with the component that makes CSS isolation work for you.
So within a component, every element, no matter how nested, gets a unique ID for it to be able to latch on?
It will, as long as it has a root level element, the CSS isolation will kick in, and the root level element will give it that specificity. The application that I have here is actually written in Blazor, and there's some examples of usage in here too. We can actually jump into Visual Studio and look at some of these. But the main thing is right now is to understand that it creates this GUID on the elements within that component. And this is all done for you at the compiler level. You don't actually have to write these GUID identifiers. It will attach those to the code for you. And as long as they are in a file that is named the same as your component with the suffixes at the end, you will get this effect here.
And if I wanted to have my H1 inherit the global styles, is that naturally what happens, or do you have to do something else?
There's ways to get that to work. I've got some more slides here that'll help us kind of understand how to scope things so you don't get those conflicts. If you have in your CSS file the CSS isolation file in H1, then that H1 inside of your component will have CSS isolation applied. If you don't have this H1 specified, it will pick up the global style sheet instead.
Yeah, gotcha.
So if you're you're considering when you should use this, you do want to use CSS isolation when it's specific to the component. And then you don't want to use it if the CSS applies to many components. You want to stay within Sass or something like a global style sheet and try to be as dry as possible. Or do not repeat yourself. If you find yourself repeating CSS code in those isolated files over and over again, it probably didn't belong in a component. So if you're repeating yourself many times, pull that out, stick that in the global CSS. And then don't use it if you're going to be publishing your components as a Razor class library. And this is, very similar to what we do at Progress. Like if we put those things in CSS isolation, then our customers wouldn't be able to rebrand those components and put their own style sheet on them. So if you want some customization from your users, you don't want to make those isolated CSS. I'd say do use it in new projects. If you're, greenfielding a new Blazor project, experiment with it, figure out where it fits in the project. Don't completely shy away from it just because it sounds different. I kind of did that at first. I was like, I don't get it. It ruins the cascading of my style sheets. But once I actually tried it out, I could see where some things actually made a lot of sense. Like for this presentation, there is some isolation with certain like every slide in the presentation is a component, and there are certain slides that have isolation so they can have certain layouts and things that I'm not using anywhere else.
So we are actually looking at a Blazor app right now. That's very meta of you.
This is very meta. It's very much a Blazor app.
Nice.
The nice thing is I'll be able to tear into some of it and do some demos without having to exit the slides. One thing that's a bit of a piece of advice here is if you already have some well-structured CSS or Sass code, don't rewrite that with CSS isolation just for the sake of doing it the Blazor way. Like if it's not broke, don't fix it. Like, don't go back and re-engineer it just because you're like, oh, this isolation thing is cool. If it's already working, you don't need to go back and rewrite it anyway. So if it's like a legacy app you're migrating, I wouldn't really concern yourself with this isolation stuff too much unless you feel like it's going to give you some tremendous value. And the job of this is to, restrict the style of the component so it can't be affected by, something else in the CSS codes. You don't have maybe developers that are overriding the design system that maybe your design team worked really hard on. It's easy to enforce a consistent theme across the application. It's great for domain-specific component libraries that aren't, using other design systems within maybe the organization or outside the org. It doesn't work well with Sass, by the way. So you're going to be writing CSS code mainly with CSS isolation. Sass is engineered to look for that input file, that one entry file, and then it kind of imports everything through that Sass file. If you were to try to write all of your component CSS isolation components in Sass, you would have to literally compile every component's Sass file. Sass doesn't have a way of like blanket, like looking at a directory and just pulling all the Sass files because of the fact that order of operations matters with this stuff. So that was never a feature of Sass because you generally have a very specific way of determining which CSS files or Sass files you want to compile in what order, because if you compile them in different orders or random orders, you could get different effects because of the cascading feature of CSS. So it's not really friendly with CSS isolation. So you're going to have some separation of your Sass system and maybe the overall theme of your components, and then maybe some one-off instances where you're using CSS isolation without the Sass stuff. The one nice thing about it, though, is if you remove a component from your project, the CSS from that isolated file also gets removed with it. This is something that can be hard to maintain with a global style sheet. It's one of the big complaints that you see from people is they have like this legacy CSS code floating around, and if you remove it, you're not sure if it's going to break anything. You can breathe easy with CSS isolation because it's literally scoped to the component. Whether the component's there or not, it will be added to the project or not. One of the little kind of exit strategies for the behavior of CSS isolation is you might have this need to style something that is in a component deeper in the hierarchy. So you kind of need, it feels like a global value, but it's not quite. It's only at the parent-child level. And if you ever need this, it's called the deep selector. So if you have a hierarchy where there's a parent component that has something inside of a child component that you want the parent to style, you can actually do that through a deep selector. So in the example we have here, we have an H1 tag on the parent and an H2 tag on the child. And because the child component is nested within the parent, this deep selector is actually going to go into the H2 tag within the child component and style that H2 tag. So you can see the actual output of it down here live in the browser. That's one of the benefits of having this live presentation based on a project. So we can actually see this happening in real time. So these deep selectors are nice for nested scenarios. Now, if you find yourself writing a whole lot of deep selectors for a component, it's likely that you're missing some abstraction somewhere, and the thing that you're scoping deep on over and over again probably needs to be broken into its own component and have its own CSS isolation. So it's easy to detect a code smell if you see yourself writing this deep selector a lot. So you probably need to take whatever this child information is and create components out of it. So keep an eye out for that. So we talked about CSS isolation, how it kind of narrows the scope. And then we've got Sass, and it's kind of a global scope. And there's got to be some kind of happy place between these. So this actually breaks down into a whole other segment here of a sliding scale, I like to say, of levels of scope and finding the right fit of customization. So at like the very top here, number one, we've got global customization. So if in this type of a scenario, we've got everything in the system can be affected by the global style design system of the application. So one really good example, again, is our Telerik UI for Blazor components. We literally have a tool that will let you globally customize all of the components, 100 plus components that come with our library. This is where you have everything at the top level that you can change a variable, and all of the components change their values based on that global customization. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we've got like completely using CSS isolation, and we've tightly just locked down all of the style sheets to where the only way to make changes to colors and sizes and layout is by touching a component and changing its CSS isolation file. So this could be really rigid and difficult to get work done once these things are set in stone. And then the global thing might be a little bit too Wild West for folks in certain domains where you don't want people changing certain things in the look and feel of the application. So number two is like the balanced mode. Like, how can we balance these two things out where we've got some global settings? If we really need to change the entire theme of our application, we can. But we're locking down certain pieces to where we don't accidentally step on our own toes and let people do things they shouldn't do with the theme of the app. So that's what we're going to talk about next. One of the things I think is really helpful with this is a feature of CSS3 called the CSS Custom Properties. You could also call these variables, CSS variables. The actual name for this is CSS Custom Properties, but everybody usually just says CSS variables because that's about what they do. At the technical level, they do exist as properties within CSS, but they act like variables. They follow the same rules as CSS, so they have the same specificity as CSS selectors. So there's some nice things that we can do. I'll also show you some tricks here in a minute. This also lets us use variables without Sass compilation. So this lets you change the value of some properties at runtime, whereas Sass is at compile time. So you can actually set up CSS custom properties where you could do on-the-fly theme changes. You could even let the user select, the colors they'd like to use for the theme of your application if you wanted to. So that's something interesting that custom properties can do for you that Sass can't.
I do have a quick question, if you don't mind, because you talked about the build time versus. So with all of the power that Sass is bringing to the table, like this kind of is the fluidity of it, right? You load up your CSS and then you got your dev tools and you're hacking away. So can you not do anything like that in Sass?
The dev tools are pretty friendly with Sass these days. Usually if you want to change a variable, though, it does require some kind of recompile to make that happen. There might be some third-party tools that'll let you kind of do that in real time, but the compilation happens so fast, though, Sam. You can use things like hot reload, and you could be in a Sass file and change it, but you can't really change the variables from the browser tools.
Right.
But you can make a code change and see it in real time.
And with like regular CSS now, if you go into a DevTools and if you are changing things on the fly, is there a way of saving it and bringing it back to your app?
So I've seen tools that do it. They usually are double-edged swords where you accidentally are saving things out of the browser into your source code where you don't want to. They can be kind of clunky to get hooked up. There's some stuff that's in the works at Microsoft. I don't know if I'm at liberty to talk about. Then there's been some things in the past that I've tried that just they were neat features, like they were like wow factor, but then in real everyday use, they just didn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, like the hot reload stuff is so quick nowadays.
You can use, by the way, CSS variables inside of Sass code. So I like to always start coding anything by using the native features of the platform first. And that goes for like HTML, CSS, C#, JavaScript. Like if it's built in, like use that first. And then if for some reason you need more power, reach for Sass, right? So I like to start with CSS variables. And then if for some reason I need the Sass variables, then I'll take them. One of those reasons you might use Sass variables over CSS ones is Sass has these built-in color functions that are really nice. So you can take like your primary color and say, tell Sass, give me a map of this color at different shades. And it'll actually do that. So like you can have like a dark blue, a light blue, and like a medium blue, all based off of a palette through code. You can do that with Sass. You can't do that with CSS variables yet. You kind of can, but you have to switch your color styles to HSL, hue, saturation, light, lightness, I think is the correct terminology. And it's complex just to change some colors on the fly. It's kind of wonky. You can do it with Sass very, very simply. And there's an article linked here I won't go into, but it shows how to actually have the best of both worlds. So you can kind of do both. But, just without extra tooling and things, start with CSS variables first, and they'll let you do a lot of things, and you can actually migrate those into your Sass code if you need to. One thing is they help you with scope. So if you want to set a variable, the first thing you do is this double dash syntax. So you can say foo is, this would be black. And then you can set a color by using this var statement. And var is going to pull the value out of foo and set it to the color property of the whatever CSS selector you're using. So if I have a button, for example, I say color var foo, and foo was set to black here, that button is now going to be a black button. So we can set a variable, get a variable, and then we can also globally set that value. So I could say :root, and this is a CSS feature here. This is the root selector, and I could say at the root level, I'm setting foo to black. And then I can also scope this and say at the scope of this selector, foo is actually white. So I can actually control the scope within these custom properties as well. And that lets us do some pretty cool stuff. So let's look at how we can control colors or properties another way, and that's with component parameters. So we have the ability using Sass natively or CSS natively to change properties of our components. We can also use CSS code along with some Razor features here and expose those as parameters. So we could say we have a parameter of some sort of flag. For this demo, I use a flag of whether I want the aside, the smaller portion of the layout, to be on the left or right. And if it's if it's the left side is true, there's some classes that are applied to make this show up on the left or right. I can also do a full screen slide where that is turned off. So we can control these through parameters on our components. So we can have things that are set through a string. The example here is a button. So there is a base CSS value like button, and then in my parameter of CSS class, I'm appending some text or some string to the CSS class here, which gives me the ability to use all of these different color buttons without having to touch the Sass or CSS code itself. So I can say a button warning, and I get the yellow button here. If I say button danger, I get the red button. So I can actually make my components very, flexible and unique by using something like this, where we're inline creating a CSS class through the parameters that we assign to the component. And then I talked about, we just talked about the custom properties. That's kind of a global way to control your styling. And then through parameters is kind of more of a strict way to control your styling. If you kind of combine those two things together and you utilize the CSS variables with their default value, you can get away with some really interesting stuff here. So this is a scenario where I've got CSS custom property, which is targeting root, and this is my public color. I named these specifically for the demo purposes. You probably wouldn't call this public color, but it would have some other very clever name. And at the public level, this is blue. And if I don't set this color on my component, the component itself will color itself blue. Now, at the component level, I have a private property here called private color. And what it's going to do is it's going to consume this public color of blue. And if for some reason this root isn't set, I'm going to take white instead. So this is actually giving me that middle ground where I could say, I want to actually hide this from my end users. Maybe I don't necessarily want them to override all of the styles in my application. If I don't specify this at the root, the component's going to use its own color, white, as its design system. It's its design value. So this is like a kind of like public and private setters in C# code almost, where I've got this private value and it's set to white. And unless somebody overrides it at the root and calls it blue, it's going to be white. But if for some reason down the road, we change brands and I need to redo this entire application's coloring, I can go ahead and just set this root variable and it will pull that in instead, and then set the private scope to blue. And then even further, if I want to override it at the component level, I can override it by putting a selector on the actual element that's using that style and give it its own color by consuming that private color variable as well. So what that means is, these CSS custom properties, they follow those cascading rules. So depending on what scope it's set at, the root level, the component level, the element level, or even inline is even more specific and will override it even further. So what I have here is a component that is actually taking the style attribute here, and then I'm using a variable called private color. It's also going to do some other things as we change this, but it's going to take that and set that inline. So only this component is receiving that style, and it's doing it at runtime. So I can come in here and choose a different color for this component that says CSS here. And you see when I choose red, it changed to red. If I go to like a purple color, it's actually picked that color, and it's also done some calculation here to make sure it has a text color that is a contrast to the background. So it's using this. I hate inline styles. They should never be used except for when you're doing something clever like this and using a variable here. What makes this different is when I use a variable, it can affect multiple values inside of that component. Normally CSS inline styles are very shied away from because they're rigid and you can't really do anything with them. But if you use a variable here, it's a game changer. It kind of breaks the given rule that you never use inline styles, because it lets us do something cool like this. And I can even do it for the size. So you can see me change the size of this component, and it dynamically changes all of these values.
Oh, this is cool. Our good friend Code with Sean is here to inline all the things.
Inline, all the team inline. So it's funny because people get stuck on these things where they're like, never ever use inline styles. And then, you find some little loophole like this that actually gives you a lot of leverage to do something very clever. And this gives you the best of both worlds. When we went and looked at the beginning of this, we have, global customization, which is, just if I'm at the root level, I can theme my entire application. Maybe we don't want to do that. And then I don't want to make it so rigid that you have to touch every component to style it. This is right there in that balance section. So there's some CSS isolation being used here, but it's kind of got this escape code here where it says, all right, I'm going to expose a parameter that injects a value into an inline style. So this would be your variable here where it says orange, where it's this private color is actually overriding. It'll override the root. It'll override the component scope. It'll even override an element level selector because the inline style is a trump card to all of these. And I can have one component that is being, resized and recolored based on an input at runtime. I think that is pretty compelling if you want to open yours up in that way.
Yeah, I mean, some of these like newer CSS things, I mean, they're very powerful, and I mean, you can see why, like folks like you and Chris DeMarth, like you're all about just pure C#, and my favorite version of HTML that I'm going to try to apply it to is XAML, and maybe it still works. Our good friends are here. Blazor Mr. Magoo is trying to start World War III. Don't get Ed to talk about
we'll talk about Tailwind in just a minute. That's going to be the end here. I may scrap that part from the presentation at .NET Conf.
That you should never scrape the most controversial things.
So I don't know if I want to go into that at .NET Conf because I am strapped for time on that. But the bubble component that you see in the presentation here, it's opening things up through a parameter. Like our text is set here to default as CSS. You could change the text value. The background color is a parameter. The foreground color is a parameter, and the size is a parameter. And if you look, we're inline styling all three of these things. So if the parameters are set, they override it through an inline style using a CSS custom property. So it's able to have that leverage if it needs it. Otherwise, it's going to start falling back on the CSS code there. So you're going to get, if it has a components level scope, like in your CSS isolation file, you would have a selector here with some color. And if it's set there, it's going to get that color if property's not set. Now, if there is a root level color set, it will override this white value and then be set at the private level. So you've got all these different levels where you can control the look and feel of this now. And it's really very interesting. Yeah, if I were to go into the root of this project here and delete this root value out, when this slide first displays, the bubble would be white. So it's pretty interesting that you're able to do that.
So I know you got a couple more things to talk about, but let's make time where you can at least show us the meta, the structure of the project that you're showing here. Because this, to me, like coming from native land, it's amazing to me how clean the rendering is and everything is lined up right. Like, how do you get your fonts to be so nice, and how do you get the underlining to skip the things that are dropping below the line? So, show me all of that good stuff.
Yeah, we'll dig in just a minute. So one thing that I wrote to help clean up the code in my components. And it helps with the example that I showed too. So in this example, when I'm doing this, there's a lot of things that are taking place here to make that style apply correctly. And I have a little helper library. It's a little utility that lets you write very concise and conditional CSS styles for your components, or inline styles even. So this would be inside of your component, and I have class to render, and then you call in a special struct called CSS Builder. And then there's a couple little utilities that it has as methods here that you can add to control what CSS is output. So by default, I want my CSS to have the text item 1. And then I want to append some strings to it depending on things in the system here. So I want to add a class called item 2 when some condition is true. And then I want to add item 3 when some condition is true, but in this case it's false. So it's going to omit item 2, and then it's always going to have item 4 as well. So what ends up happening is you get item 1, item 2, and item 4. And since this is false, it's going to take 3 out. This is nice when you have flags and things that are controlling the style of a component. Maybe they're showing or hiding certain features, in giving something a different color, stuff like that. And you can use it for inline styles as well. And if we look back at the code in my example, you'll see this thing being
used. Who maintains this? Is this yours?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah, CSS is CSS Builder is really just a very dead simple struct with some syntactic sugar wrapped around it. And you can do something like this: say style builder, give me an empty style, and I'm going to set up this background CSS property. And if when it's not an empty string, so if this background color is set, apply the value of background color. So what this will do is it won't write this property out unless this is true, unless this is not null or white space. And that leaves me from accidentally writing out this CSS property with no value attached to it. So it will omit these unless they're being used by the parameter or being set as a parameter here. And then this third one doesn't have a condition on it, so it's always going to set a size. And this has a default size, so we don't have to worry about that one. If this was nullable, then I would probably have some sort of when value in here to control that. And this works for classes as well, so you can easily build up your CSS classes. This works really great for something like an alert box that has like several different styles that might be turned on or off depending if it's, you know, a danger or whatever. It might append certain things, or if it's disabled, it might add yet another class to have a disabled look to it. It helps you not have a bunch of if statements in there building up a CSS class. Very, very common thing that you do in a component. And then finally, we'll talk about frameworks, the hot button topic for the day. Tailwind, it's free and commercial. People don't really talk about the commercial aspect of it very often, but they do have components and templates that they would like you to buy. So that's the idea of getting you into Tailwind, is to upsell you on their various templates and components that the Tailwind folks have. Nothing wrong with that, just it is their model. They also have this very domain-specific language abstraction model where you're placing all of your CSS code in HTML. I personally don't care for that. There's an example down here of just kind of setting up some text. That's a very verbose selector or a set of CSS to apply a value to some text. And basically it's setting it to a certain size, and then it's setting it bold, and then giving it the color white. I really dislike using colors inside of a class name, but that's what they do. That's how it works. Same thing with this, like padding is 4, margin is 4, background is green 300, the shade 300, whatever that would be. And then hfull, something to do with the sizing of it. I can't remember. It does, like, people would really cringe if this was your this was your C# code, or this was like Python code or something, and your variables were named P, M, and BG green. You know, we kind of shy away from all the shorthand stuff, but when you use it with CSS and Tailwind, everybody kind of is like, okay, this is cool now. I very much dislike this approach.
Okay, so I get it. I get what you're saying. Again, I have no knowledge of what Tailwind does or is. And on the surface, like what you're describing, it sounds like a bad idea to just, you know, it's verbose and you're just putting it all out there. What's the draw? Why do people like it so much?
So one thing you have to really give to Tailwind is their documentation is fantastic. It's like the pinnacle of documentation for code. Like you should, if you want to model your documentation after something, go look at how Tailwind does their documentation. It's very great. You know, that makes it easy to use. It's easy to onboard yourself when you have great documentation. You can, you know, understand how it works. Their system works very easily because you read through the docs and they've got great samples, and you're good to go. But the end game of this is very sloppy. I don't really care for this style of writing style sheets. It's basically taking all of your CSS code and just jamming it into a class, which reminds me of old school inline styles. So this is where a lot of people are joking in the chat here that just they're like Tailwind is just inline styles with extra steps, because you're literally writing CSS code here. If you were to put this in CSS code, it would be font size, you know, some number, font weight bold, color, color colon white. It's literally verbatim what you would write in CSS, but you've just put it inside of a class. I've yet to understand the value here. Some people love it though. And then the build system for Tailwind is a custom command line, and they use Post CSS to compile their themes. So they're not using Sass; they're using Post CSS, which I don't really have an opinion on. It's just that happens to be what they use. That does mean use JavaScript for customization of that build system. And then we look at Bootstrap. It's free. I don't recall anybody upselling anything except for some themes on Bootstrap. So they don't have any paid components or templates. They do have some themes that you can buy. They have a different abstraction model. There's more of a CSS utility than it is this kind of inline style-y CSS is inside your HTML. So there are some proper class names that give you things like structure, like rows, columns, things like that. You don't really need a whole lot of these things these days. It's all built into CSS. There's still like a little bit of value in Bootstrap. Both of these frameworks are great for prototyping. If you're using the Sass version of Bootstrap, you're really cutting down the overhead of extra CSS and things it'll generate. And you're setting yourself up for easier theming and stuff down the road. You can do some similar stuff with Tailwind as well. There is an apply property that you can use that will kind of cut down on some of this cruft. But unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people use that. There's also, I need to check on the status of this one again. It was looking at the beta last time. It may be official release these days. But Sass is actually optional. Like I said, a lot of the things that Sass is doing and a lot of things these frameworks are doing is just getting adopted by CSS. So we don't even really need Sass that much these days, nor do we need Bootstrap that much these days. So Bootstrap's even dropped the dependency on Sass. You can use it optionally. It is using CSS variables internally now. So things are getting easier to customize. You don't necessarily need Sass to do all the customization, just some. So there's that. And then I thought I would talk a little bit about how we handle our themes as well with Telerik UI for Blazor. So we have a component library with over 100 components. We use Sass for all of our themes. It makes everything really easy to theme, but it's also not required. We do have a theme builder utility that will let you go online and build your theme, and it will give you those customized CSS files if you're not really comfortable using Sass. If you are comfortable using Sass, then it even makes this even easier because all you're doing is essentially getting some variables and setting them inside of the themes and customizing it that way. But we kind of have that global customization with Sass approach versus trying to use CSS isolation and stuff like that. And then we even have another way of customizing that I wanted to show. We have some built-in properties too. So we have this global customization that you can do through Theme Builder and Sass. But you can also go through, and there's these various properties on things like Button, for example, has these properties that you can just utilize out of the box. So you can have a flat button, an outline button. You can set the size of the button, medium to large. We have several base theme colors that are built in. So you could say the theme color is going to be primary, secondary, success for a green button, that type of thing. These are all set at the parameter level of a component. And then you can actually create it's just the parameters are a string. So you can feed it a custom string and you can do something like this. Well, these are built-in theme options, but I also have this one called Custom Circle where I've written some CSS code. And when I select this one, what happens is there's a parameter that's called rounded. And when I set that parameter to circle, it's going to apply that Sass code or the CSS code to that button. And you can look at the code for that here. inside of this Blazor REPL that's injected here. Trying to remember where the CSS actually went on it. There we go. There should be a... Here it is. This K rounded custom is the text that I actually picked off, the value for that text I picked off the dropdown, and it's going to apply a width, a height, and a border radius to that button. So whenever this property up here on the button rounded is set to that CSS value, it will actually just override the whole thing and give us that custom look. So there's some customization you can do just at the property level with a little bit of CSS code to kind of marry those things up, or you can use all of the built-in things that I showed that are inside these drop downs as well, like solid, flat, outline, link. Those are all built-in known things that the button can do without you having to do customization at the CSS level. And that's all I've got for the presentation. We can actually dig into the presentation now, Sam. You said you had some questions about how the sausage was made.
Yeah, just show me how you're underlining so nicely.
The underlines?
Yeah.
So that's actually just a CSS thing. So yeah, these are custom fonts I grabbed off of Google. So Google has a nice font selection. On the H1 tag, we've got text decoration color and text decoration underline. So I don't think I have my zoom tool. Let's see if I can, there we go. Zoom in there. So this is just some nice CSS code that makes this happen. And trying to get this bigger if I can. There we go. Yeah. So here's my H1 tag, and you can see the CSS isolation being used here.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's inside of a grid, and then it has some margins around it, but then it has this underline value. If I toggle that off, you can see the underline went away. And then text decoration color sets the color. By default, it's the same as the text color, unless you override that. And you see I'm using the variables here.
Where you have text that drops below the underline, how does it know to skip it?
I think that is based on the font.
Ooh, it's very smart, because the font is working with your style then.
Yeah, so you're talking about like the P right here. I think this is either part of the font, or it just knows that if it breaks through the line, the font needs to take precedence over it. Now, there is also some very interesting stuff here in the layout. So you'll notice the opening slide layout. This is actually a pretty complex layout. There's a lot going on here. So you've got text that is aligned vertically. And then you've got text that's aligned horizontally. And then there's kind of a grid here if you start looking deep enough. There's a blue box, an orange box. There is a column that has these text items in it. And then there's a column that has the sub-bullet points in it. So if we actually look at this in code here, there's some cool tools that are in the developer tools that help you kind of debug this stuff. So you see these little grid buttons everywhere. If you tag one of those grid buttons, it will enable the grid and show you where it's at. So you can see the grid setup here. So there's a grid with 25 elements here, 25 columns. This lets me split this up into a very odd shape. So if I just wanted this to be like 50-50 split down the middle of the screen, I could have done 2 columns. That would have been nice and easy. But I wanted to have kind of an offset look to it. So you could see the first 6 columns are the blue background. The second part of the column is the orange, or second part of the layout is the orange columns, and it's 6 through 9 are taking up those 3 columns. And then the rest of it kind of sits out in this other space, and the way it's able to do that and kind of overlap here is there's actually another grid nested underneath, and there's also a grid allowing these pieces over here So you'll see subgrids underneath. So this is a 2-column grid where the text has been rotated 90 degrees. And then there's a grid here that's been offset to overlap this orange column. So if you look at the kind of pink grid on the outside and the yellow grid on the inside, the way these bubbles are overlapping this orange is they're actually taking and occupying the same grid space as the orange columns. This entire grid actually shifts over to columns 8 and 9 of the peach grid here, and sits in this and overlaps in this one column. So there's things that you can do with CSS Grid that are really creative here. Overlapping grid columns is one of them. So let's do really complex layouts, and you could do this with very simple CSS code. You don't need a whole framework like Bootstrap or Tailwind to do it. I think the reason people gravitate to things like Tailwind, though, is there's examples in the documentation that show you how to do this stuff. If you go to the CSS documentation, which is you're going to find various sources for that, whether it's like MSDN or MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network, W3C, stuff like that. You'll find similar documentation. It's not as flashy and doesn't have that nice user-friendly look to it. It's very, like reading a white paper. But you can do all of this stuff, and you can actually, mess with some of the different aspects of those grids right inside of the browser and do things with them.
Yeah, very, very cool. Yeah, 'cause, I mean, we have similar concepts in the native world as well, with, because like the native world is heavily inspired by CSS and Flex and all that. So we do the exact same tricks of overlapping and letting the margin, drive how much you're eating into the other grid and so on. So yeah.
Well, that's one of the things, though, Sam. Back in the day, you used to have to use like negative margins to do this.
Yeah.
This is all being done with XY coordinates instead now. So negative margins in CSS used to really throw off layouts, and you had to compensate with either JavaScript or add some weird padding to make things actually flow right. With CSS Grid, you can do this without those negative aspects of it.
The hacks, essentially.
Yeah, so there's no more hacks here. There's actually just some code in here telling this grid. Let's see if we find the yellow grid again. Display grid. There should be something in here telling it. I'm trying to remember exactly where it was. I can't find it off the top of my head, but there's something that says literally go to grid column 8 and start here. And then the orange box has a similar piece of code that says, whoops, didn't mean to do that. It will say, go from column 6 to 9 and draw, this is orange, and then this one is overlapping. It says, 8 to 25, this is where you belong. Even though they both overlap these same pieces, it doesn't cause any issue.
Yeah, very cool, very cool. Okay, here's the question here from my side, because all of this is great, because like for Blazor developers doing web stuff, you got so much of choice. You can start all global with Sass, and then you can drill down and you can do inline, you can do component-based scoping. But what happens when all of this is brought over to desktop and mobile? I mean, I'm guessing all of this is still usable as is, but what does your build pipeline look like? Are you going to have to now do things like, oh, I'm on a Mac, let me do an npm script to build my Sass, or I'm on Windows? How do you balance all of your styling when it comes over to .NET MAUI?
It shouldn't matter. It should work on all platforms the same way. So you can either use package.json and use script files like these. You can use the JavaScript version of Sass.
There is no npm in .NET MAUI, though. There's no Node.js. It's like, especially when it's running on desktop or on mobile, there is no.
But that's a build time thing.
Yeah. Okay. So you do have to build your Blazor app outside of your .NET MAUI app.
it still all gets built together, but when you
I
deploy
mean, as long,
you're
yeah, as
deploying
long as
CSS.
you're
You're not deploying
right,
Sass.
right.
So
Okay, okay. As long as your build machine has everything that it needs
yep,
to build.
yep. As long as your build machine has Dart SAS installed or JavaScript SAS installed,
Right. Okay.
those will work just fine. And if you're not using Sass, you don't even need to worry about any of this. You could just use pure CSS and still will make all this work. But if you do want Sass, at the very least, you would have something running Dart Sass off the command line. NPM is just one way of running scripts. You could use MS Build. I think I have that in this project as well. So there is a build. Yeah, there we go. So this just builds using Dart Sass. So as long as Dart Sass is installed on the machine, and it's pretty common on like build pipelines like GitHub. So if you're building through like GitHub Actions or something like that, you could do it that way as well. So when you're deploying, as long as that deployment, your DevOps has the Sass, Dart Sass installed, it'll work there as well.
Yeah.
So if you're building beyond your local machine, this is just fine too.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, with that said, as a Windows developer, always make sure your file names are case sensitive, even if you're not paying attention normally to case sensitivity. Because if your configuration says capital theme for the directory, and when it gets deployed to a Linux box it's lowercase, this thing's gonna blow up. So watch your casing, even if it doesn't matter on Windows. It probably matters on the deploy system.
Yeah, you got a lot of choice of how you style. I wish the native world had as much of choice and flexibility, but we're getting there slowly. And like you said, all of this is now welcome. However you want to deploy this. All right, very, very cool. And anything else said you got?
I'll just throw the final slide back up there for anybody who wants to get the links, and I'll paste them in chat as well. You could take this and clone it and run it, and you can see all of the code that runs this as well. So if you go to, let's go to my website.
This is very nicely done, by the way.
Thank you. Let's see, this is CSS for Blazor developers. There's the whole presentation here. I'll copy that into chat. And you can find that on my GitHub page as well. And this has literally all the presentation is the code is the presentation type of a thing. So you do have to run the npm install on it to get the themes to compile, or you could run the Dart Sass compiler directly on it.
Very
Other
nice.
than that, it should work just fine.
Yeah, and sorry, go.
You can see how the theme is all laid out. I tried to use best practices here. So there is a single Sass file that imports all of the modules that belong to it. And then all of the components are in a file. All of the layouts for all of the different slide types. There's a content slide, regular slide, a transition slide, which is like the category level slides. Those are all in there. And then there are the individual slides as well. There's actually every slide is a component.
Very cool. Very cool.
Thanks, Mr. Magoo. We'll see you soon.
Yeah. Like as Mr. Magoo said, Ed, thanks for this. This is very educational for me as a non-web developer. But Blazor, Mr. Magoo, Code with Sean, everyone. Thanks for the comments. Thanks for keeping things interactive.
Before we get too far into our closing statement, of all these 4 bullet points, does anybody have anything that helped them more than others Like this, I got to get 20 minutes out of this talk.
Oh
So I
boy.
got to break this down. Like, does the Sass info help? Is the CSS isolation stuff more pertinent than the scope stuff? Or, is the middle two the most important? Can I leave the bookends off? What works for you guys?
I'll go. I think all of it together is the comprehensive story, but you can totally skip. I mean, 20 minutes, you don't have much time. You can skip some of the deep dives. But
Yeah.
the overall story of all four together needs to be told, and then you should show off your presentation as code and code as presentation. That's nice because people can play around with it.
Okay. Yeah, I might have to glance over
Yeah, just
part
glance over.
one and
Hmm.
if there's time, even talk about four. I think the two and three are the meat and potatoes here,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
Hmm. Yep, exactly.
Okay, cool.
All right, friends. I think that's the show. So, Ed, thank you so much. I want to bring your screen down, but thanks for hanging out with us. And this was the October meetup of our user group, and we'll see you right here for the November meetup. And yeah, we'll see who the speaker is. And yeah, have fun, folks. Ed and me will go have dinner, and wherever you are in the world, go do your thing. Hope you have a great rest of your evening. Yeah, and yeah,
Yeah, appreciate the invite, Sam. Thank you for hosting me tonight.
absolutely. Take it easy, folks, and have a good one.
All right, take care. Bye bye.
Bye.